Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope all of you are doing well, and today I have a long video for all of you. It's gonna cover all the homemade trading card games I've made over the years, just a brief overview of all of them, so I invite you to kick back, relax, and enjoy as I dive into the history of my homemade card games. Before we get into the video proper, I wanted to start with a bit of a disclaimer. Some of the older cards from the older games I have thrown out over the years, unfortunately. I do have some stuff saved, but the oldest cards I ended up throwing a lot of them out, so unfortunately I won't have them to show you. So a lot of what I know, a lot of the information about the earliest games I've made was basically on like memories I have, and it's just stuff I've written down over the years just for documentation purposes. But when I do have pictures of some cards, I will show them. It's just I won't have pictures for all of them. Just keep that in mind. And I want to start off with how I first got into trading card games in general, and that was in 1999, during the summer of 1999 specifically, when I got my first base set Pokemon cards from one of my friends at school. It was a base set Squirtle and base set Dragonair, and that was enough to kick off my love for trading card games and trading card game design. And naturally, when you first get into a card game, one of the first things you want to do is to try to make some of your own custom cards, and so that's what I ended up doing pretty early after I got my first Pokemon cards. And then you had Yu-Gi-Oh! Come in around the early 2000s, which showed off a different style of game. Mostly was exposed to it through reading about the different video games and magazines, as well as seeing the TV show a bit. And that actually inspired me as well to really get into trading card game making. That was where I made my first game, which was basically a Yu-Gi-Oh! Ripoff, to put it nicely. I don't know what the rules of that game were, unfortunately, but since then I've been collected and played over a dozen different trading card games, and you'll be able to see right here some of the different games I've collected and played over the years. You have Pokemon, of course, as well as Magic the Gathering, as well as some more recent entries like One Piece. You got Star Wars Unlimited, as well as the recent Lorcana as well as some more obscure games. You got the Final Fantasy card game as well, and you also have one example of a homemade card game here in Sketchbook Chronicles. I have since added a couple other homemade card games to this list in the form of Chaos Galaxy and Ultimate Cross, but those unfortunately didn't make it into this picture. And then we go to 2004 with Make Your Own Trading Card Game Season 0. This was a game that was started by my brother and his friends while they were in school together, and I ended up jumping in on as well. The gameplay for this game was pretty simple. It was basically Fancy War. You both flipped over the top card of your deck, and then whoever's power was higher was the winner, and you get to keep both of the cards. And we just ended, and really the whole customization aspect was where we just drew the cards, what was on them. But this was enough to plant the seed for future card games we would make. And that brings us to 2007 with the Make Your Own Trading Card Game Season 1. This was the first true HTCG we made, and the gameplay of this was kind of a hybrid of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon. Characters had attack and defense values, and it was your attack versus their defense, and the difference would be subtracted from an opponent's life points. You reduce the life points to 0 and you win the game. And the Pokemon aspect comes in where you add an active character as well as bench characters you could bring in when your active character was knocked out. The rules weren't quite well fleshed out. We have included other mechanics over the years with different types of cards, but The game wasn't quite very balanced. I mean, and some games ended up lasting long. I remember some games taking as long as 3 hours at times to finish. But overall, it was still kind of a fun time. But between myself, my brother, and a few of our friends, there were at least 500 cards made for this game, which is pretty impressive. And unfortunately, I don't have them anymore, especially since I threw them out when we made the Season 2 cards. And so far, the only proof that this game existed at one point was in the Season 2 rulebook I made for Make Your Own TCG Season 2. I discussed some of the differences between the old rules and the new rules, which, if you want to, you can pause the screen and read some of them if that sort of thing interests you. Next, I come into my own card game. This is the Nintendo vs. Sega TCG. It was kind of a mixture of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pop-Up Duel. This is the card. The Pop-Up Duel card is what you're seeing on the screen. And the Pop-Up Duel, if you don't know, is a mini game from, I think it was called Chocobo Tales. It's a DS game that's a spin-off of the Final Fantasy series that was a card game, and where cards had these 4 elemental zones, and they could have different symbols in them, like a sword for attacking or a shield. And how attacking works is you each played a card, and you look for attack symbols, and you match them toward the same elemental zone of the opponent's card. And depending on how the symbols matched up, you would do full damage with your attack, or half damage, or none. And there were different abilities cards had, but anyway, this kind of also mixed in with Yu-Gi-Oh's attack and defense values, so you had multiple ways of attacking your characters, and in certain situations, you could do more damage to your opponent with your different characters. And unfortunately, I only really made starter decks for this game. And I also tried this sort of concept again with the Mario and Sonic TCG I made in 2009, but I think that was an entirely different rule set for it, based on a different card game I own. So I didn't really get very far with these. Where I did really get far into card making was with Paper Mario TCG Season 1. I was kind of inspired by the card collecting aspect of Super Paper Mario, which was the new game at the time. This was 2008 after all. And inspired by the turn-based combat in the older Paper Mario games. This gameplay was similar to Pokemon. The main difference is there was no energy to attach to your characters to perform attacks. Characters could just use their attack stat and compare it to the opposing character's defense stat, and that would reduce their hit points. There was also a different win condition for this game, where if you knock out characters, you would collect star points, and the first to get 100 star points wins the game. The other big difference is that players had 2 active characters. This was kind of like Mario and his partner from the first 2 games. And I made quite a few cards for this game, at least 2 sets worth. The first set was just the unnamed base set, which had 72 cards in it. And then there was set 2, which was called Deadly Forces, where I introduced a few new mechanics to the game, which was 41 cards. There was also an unreleased third set that I had planned that had over 80 cards in it, and it was primarily cards from the first 2 Paper Mario games in that last set. The first 2 sets had a lot more concepts from Super Paper Mario because, again, it was the new game at the time. Next is the Super Smash Bros. TCG, and this was kind of unique because usually I would make my cards out of regular printer paper, but this one I remember getting these different colored poster boards at a store one day, and I had the idea of cutting them into smaller pieces and gluing some paper onto them, and that would create the sturdiness for the cards, and that would give each color in the game their own unique card backs. And this was a game that also played a little bit more like Magic, where you had a resource system and the different colors with their own unique mechanics. It was also inspired by a couple of other games I'd heard about and played. Mainly, like, there was a Flash game called Mytheria. That was like this sci-fi card game that had a different types of units in it, and it played kind of similarly. And I was also equally inspired by Capcom versus SNK Card Fighters, which had a similar gameplay style. And unfortunately, I didn't really get too far into this game either, only really getting into a couple of starter decks. I do remember, though, like, I have the original checklist for this still. The first set was going to have at least 99 cards in it. And you can see some of in this picture here, you've got 6 different colors of characters. You have their costs in the corner, as well as they have hit points and strength. Some of them even have abilities. And a lot of the characters in this game were from the Super Smash Bros. Series. Super Smash Bros. Brawl for Wii was the new game at the time, so a lot of the characters originated from that game. And you even got Shadow here, who is an assist trophy in that game, but here he's pretty playable. I still have the cards, more of the cards for this, so if you want to see more of this game, I'll definitely be glad to show off all these cards. And next we get into 2014 with the Season 2 of the Make Your Own card game. This is the season that the current season of Make Your Owns is based off of. Many of the changes to this game were there were smaller stats on the characters, as well as also having its own dedicated resource system, which is the power system, where you slowly accumulate power over the game up to a max of 10, and you spend power to play different cards. And while this didn't have quite as many cards as the first season, there were still quite a few cards made for this. I remember I know I have at least 200 still, and probably more. I'm not sure how accurate the 300 is, but I do know I at least made another deck for a friend, so that's 40 cards there. And then I've kind of revisited versions of this game over the years. Like, I made a 400 card cube draft, which has its own rules back in 2022, but I didn't really get to the point where I colored in those cards. But I'll explain more when I get to showing off those. And then there's also the 20th anniversary cards, which you're seeing on screen now. This is the make your own version that's available on Untap for you to play. And then these are just a sampling of some of the cards from Make Your Own Season 2. You can see there's a lot of familiar characters in here, especially if you've taken the time to browse through the cards on Untap. Like, you have Super Coin, you have Sinister Plot and Fix It, as well as some of the characters, like the Delta Warriors were here. And as well as some other cards like Ultimate Warrior, who is named Malicious Master Max in the new version of the game. But yeah, this is kind of where the current version of Make Your Owns comes from. And then here's kind of some of the cards I've made for that draft cube I mentioned earlier. And this has a couple of its own mechanics you can see on some of the cards. For example, there was Summoning Sickness in that version. As you can see, there's a card here that has Haste, which allows it to attack on the same turn it comes into play. There are also some cards that could produce character tokens, and as well as the ability to tap cards for effects. So this is kind of a weird offshoot of the game, and I might use some of those cards in the current version later on, but as you can see, I didn't really color these because it was mainly myself playing this game, so I didn't really feel the need to do that. I also made a Season 2 of the Paper Mario trading card game in 2015, and this had a few minor changes, but it mostly played the same. The one big change was a simplification of how the point system worked, and also giving characters levels, where depending on the level of a character was, that was how many star points you got for defeating them. And to add on to this, there was a level up mechanic introduced, where characters could get bigger and stronger and potentially get new powers. I only really made 2 starter decks again for this game, but I also had plans to make a 60 card base set for this. And you can see here what some of the newer Season 2 cards look like. You got the regular characters, their health level, their attack and defense stat. And then you have their level up counterparts, which had bigger stats and they looked more flashier in their artwork. And then there was also another mechanic introduced, as you can see, and surrounding them you had assist cards, which function sort of like supporters in the Pokemon card game, where you could play only one on your turn, but they would have very powerful effects. And then I also have, again, I tried my hand again at refining the template for my Paper Mario cards. As you can see, this was a more recent version of these, with the color in which the colors pop more. But you have also some abilities that you can use with flower points you would get throughout the game. But again, I didn't really get very far into making this, but it is something I was really interested in back in the day. Next, we get into the Collided Worlds TCG back in 2017. This was going to be a game that I was going to make myself, that would star my own original characters, but I didn't really get really far into this. There are a lot of variations on the rules for this game that I'm still trying to work on. And this game kind of started out as like a combination of Magic and Pokemon. You had Magic's resource system, but you also had Pokemon's system of attacking as well, where characters would have to pay resource to use an attack. And over time, I've been spending a lot of time refining the different rules. I've also made like a 300 card cube version of this as well for drafting, and I'm still kind of working on this off and on. As you can see some of the stuff I've created for this here, you can see different versions of the cards I've made, as well as different rule booklets, as well as art for things like booster packs and for starter decks here. And then we get into like a closer look at the cards themselves. Some of them have art, some of them don't. Probably because when I would make these versions, I didn't really kind of like how they played. But you got the first version in this corner. You can see the edition 0.1, which had the battle points and hit points, as well as cost, as well as the different types of attacks they would have. And then moving on, I kind of got rid of like the special attack system I had. And then later I would introduce a system of elements to the game. I think at first there were 6 elements, as well as colorless. And then I would change the template again. And then I would actually consolidate battle points and hit points into a single stat called combat power. And I would change up the resource system as well. Instead of having like tokens you would use to pay for cards, you could use any card and put it into a resource row and it would function as a system. I definitely would like to go over the different versions of this game one day, just to kind of show you some of the things I've been working on with it. So definitely let me know if you want to see that in the comments below. And now we get to the Clash Act TCG. This is a card game I've shown off fairly recently in a playtest video. And this sort of began as a side project, trying to experiment with different things, but it has grown into kind of something a little bigger than that. This was the game that used the shared turn system in its best of 9 game structure, where each player would take turns playing a card one at a time, and then you'd send characters up to clash, and then you try to win these small skirmishes, and if you win 5 out of 9, you would win the entire match. And I have made 3 full starter decks and about 54 functionally unique cards for this game, and I've also recently started to experiment with templates for the final versions of these cards. But you can see I've got The templates for my test cards are a little more basic, but I'm also kind of experimenting here too. I'm definitely going to continue working on this game a little bit more, try to refine the rules, and possibly get this through a release. We will see. And that about does it to cover the entire history of my homemade card games. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, definitely leave me a like and comment down below which of these games you like the most and what you want to learn more about. I'll definitely see you guys in the next video, and until then, take care.